Brushes are loosely organized into 5 categories, as denoted by the color of their icon. At the top, we have light blue, and those behaviors are more additive and subtractive, as if material is being added to your geometry or being removed. Below that, we have red, and these deal with the geometry that's already there. Like smooth, for example, takes 2 verts and averages them together. The yellow brushes are more about moving geometry around. White brushes are utility in their function. And below that, we have your transform brushes, which are like traditional transformations, moving, rotating, and scaling inside sculpt mode, so you don't have to jump to object mode or edit mode. And at the very bottom, we have the annotate tool, which is great for making notes in the viewport. So we're going to start at the top and just go down the list. You've already seen the draw brush. It's the standard baseline brush inside sculpt mode, and it just lays down a very smooth additive type stroke. It kind of reminds me of in cartoons when you see a character burrowing under the ground and leaving that trail behind. That's kind of what it reminds me of. Next, you have draw sharp. Now, this one is similar in nature, except in the center of the stroke, we're going to get a sharp line. And by default, again, this is negative. I personally like to make it additive. That way, whenever I think or say hold control, that means push inward versus outward. And so, yeah, that's good for making creases or cuts in your surface. Next, we've got the clay brush. This is, in my opinion, if we just make a couple strokes, it's like a very subtle draw brush. If we just go back to the draw brush and make the strength very low, it has very similar behavior. And I think this is just to feel kind of mushy like clay. And that's at least how the result is. It's a very mushy type way of sculpting. I've never really used the clay brush. Next, we've got clay strips. This one I do use a lot. This is great as like a 3D sketching of sorts. And what I mean by sketching, if we go down to the annotate tool and I do an example, you have a way of drawing if you make straight lines like this, if we're drawing a cube. And we also have the sketch approach, which is drawing several lines, and kind of the average of all those lines is the resulting shape. That's a sketch. And let me just get rid of that. The clay strips brush is like a 3D sketch, where it's great for building up shapes with a lot of strokes. And it's a very free-form way to achieve shapes. It's a common way that a lot of sculptors like to build up shapes. It depends on the situation for me, but I definitely do like building up with clay strips. It's just a very free-form way to go about it. Next, we have the layer brush. Now, if I just make a stroke here, you'll see that our stroke shoots out very quickly, so it's a strong brush by default, but then the stroke kind of hits a ceiling where it stops, and that shape is exactly the same as when it started. So it's sort of like an extrusion brush. Now you can control how far you're extruding by, in the brush settings, you can change the height right here. So if we go to 0.1, for example, it's a much smaller extrusion, but you can see how the shape is like creating an extruded layer. This is not a brush I use very often, maybe once or twice in my entire Blender experience. Next, we have the inflate brush. This is something that I use a lot. However, I'm just going to revert my file to get my smooth sphere back. And the inflate brush does exactly what you would think. It's like blowing a balloon up at the surface, which by making a stroke just now, it doesn't look that different from draw. However, if I use the grab brush and create a different shape, we've got sort of a Pokemon-like creature with some big thin ears swooping upward. So the inflate brush is great if I want to make the ears thinner. So I'm holding control and pushing the surfaces toward each other. And so that's going to thin the surface. Whereas if I just inflate normally, it's going to make all surfaces under that brush expand outward. So I find this very useful, and even beyond just making surfaces thinner or thicker, I also find it to be kind of preferable for building up smooth shapes, kind of as a replacement for draw. Also probably out of convenience because inflate has the I hotkey, whereas draw doesn't have a hotkey. So I'll typically use inflate more often. Next we have blob, which if we compare to inflate, this is blob and this is inflate. Blob is a stronger effect and the edges are a little bit sharper. But overall, they're very similar. And you can achieve the same shapes with the inflate brush. So I never use blob, but it would be good for like warts or something like that. Next, we've got the crease brush, which is very similar in purpose to the draw sharp brush. So if let's see, it's also negative by default. I like to switch that to positive. If I hold control so it goes negative in direction, you can see that we're creating a very sharp crease. Now, the key difference between this and draw sharp, if I turn on our wireframe and make another stroke, you'll see the wireframe get dense inside of the crease. And that's because the brush is also pulling towards the center, whereas the draw sharp brush does not pull towards the center. It leaves the geometry where it is. There's no pinch effect. Let's turn off the wireframe. Both have their uses depending on the situation. I typically use crease because I like my creases to be sharper and that pinch effect achieves that. But it also has some negative effects that it stretches out the geometry. But both are very useful. Next we have the smooth brush, which is the first of the red brushes. So this can be activated by holding shift. So I never really select that brush by itself. It also has a hotkey, the S hotkey. So if we switch to a different brush, hit S, that will switch to the brush explicitly. I'm not really sure why it has its own hotkey when it also has the shift ability, but I'm not making the rules. The functionality, as you can guess, it takes the geometry that's there and averages their position, so you get a very intuitive smoothing effect. Next, we have the flatten brush. Now this one is, I think, appropriately named, but I've always thought that it should produce a flatter result. So as we mark on the surface, it's not exactly clear what it's doing, but it is flattening in the center of the stroke, but it's also bringing out the boundary of the brush and raising that up off the surface. Let's see if I can make this a little more evident. Right here, for example, if I try to smooth this out, you can see on the other side, it's raising the edge and flattening the center. So it's kind of doing an averaging effect as well. And so this is good for kind of flattening out organically, or mushy as I sometimes refer to it. But it's not very good for hard surface sculpting. It leaves it, again, too mushy, not flat. But we have another brush that does that a little bit better. We'll get to that in a second. We have the fill brush next. Now, if I take the draw sharp brush and try that again. So I'm pushing a crease into the surface. Now the fill brush is also very well named, because if I start drawing a stroke in the center of that crease, it's like it's filling up with water. The brush is smart enough to recognize high peaks and low divots and simply fill those divots. Now the opposite behavior, if I have a crease that's kind of sticking out of the surface and take a fill, hold control, it's deepening the divots. And so I rarely deepen divots with the fill brush, but I do sometimes fill. Probably 5% of the time I'll use fill in this way. Next, we have the scrape brush. This is a very useful tool. It's one of my most used brushes. And if we just start sculpting on the surface, this is much more of the flattening behavior that I expect when I see something called flatten, where we have hard edges and a very smooth flat surface in the middle. So this is much better for hard surface sculpting. I also find that it's very intuitive if you've ever sculpted with clay and used the scrape tool, which is certainly where the name came from. That, triangular shaped tool that you shave away the surface, it feels a lot like that. So it's a very, very good brush in the sense of being intuitive. It's also got some extra powers, some extra abilities. So by default, it's very useful, but it's also very forgiving and dynamic, kind of conforming to the surface. You can see that as I make strokes, it's kind of faceting the surface that's already there, the shape that's already there. However, we can adjust the scrape brush to have a stronger effect, sort of like sculpting styrofoam where you chunk out pieces. And if we go to the brush menu, I referred to this earlier, but if we turn on original normal and original plane, you'll see that this creates a very rigid scrape effect. So let's do it on the corner up here where it's a little more noticeable. You'll see that I can create a perfect facet and then it limits itself. Whereas with those settings turned off, it will kind of adjust to the new surface. And so if I try and make this a little bit stronger, my brush bigger, you can see the effect that it's having. It's like a laser, shaving off bits and pieces. And this is good for, creating like a gemstone where we get a very, very faceted surface. But even more so, if we switch the sculpt plane to view plane, now that 3D plane that is creating the facets is aligned to the way you're viewing the object. And so if I start to plane away a surface, this flattened portion is aligned to the way that our eye, this is supposed to be an eye, is looking at the object. And so the result is pretty extreme flattening and carving of the surface. We definitely transition from less of a flattened behavior to a carving. And so this is very, very useful for hard surface sculpting. I love the scrape brush. I know I spent a lot of time on it, but very, very powerful. And so that's the blue and red brushes. Next, we'll move on to the yellow and white brushes.